So clearly, Lancelot, I need to stop pounding on this desk. So clearly. Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about Arthurian Fantasy, something I never thought that I would say on this channel, yet here we are. So every month I pick a subgenre at random, and then I read 3 books that can fit into that subgenre. For the month of August, I drew Arthurian Fantasy and was instantly terrified. I've never read Arthurian Fantasy before and didn't know much about it. Other than that, it's stories, books, novels, what have you, that incorporate the legends of King Arthur and King Arthur's court and all of that fun stuff. Now, what you do need to know is that everything that I know about King Arthur's court, I've either been taught by Disney or a Sean Connery movie, basically. So when I say I was going into this pretty naive and pretty fresh and pretty new, that would be a bit of an understatement. What I can tell you, though, coming out of it, after reading 3 Arthurian Fantasy novels, is that this is the reason that I started the genre project. Not only did I learn so much about a genre and was able to identify the ways in which I can relate to that genre and what place that genre could potentially have in my life, but I also read books that I wasn't a fan of, and I read quite possibly my favorite book of all time. What? Is that possible? Is this happening right now? First, let me tell you about the books that I read, and then I'll tell you how I feel about Arthurian Fantasy in general, and then I will very specifically tell you how I feel about each book. Now, the first book came highly recommended to me by more than one individual. It is The Mists of Avalon. This is by Marion, Zimmer, Bradley. So I grabbed the audiobook for this one. The audiobook, though, was 50 hours long. I did not make it. Don't start patting me on the back yet. I did not make it. So The Mists of Avalon was originally released in 1983, and it is essentially the whole legend. I mean, the book spans generations, and what sets it apart from the other Arthurian fantasies that had been told up until that time, and I believe since then, the author tells the story through the perspective of the female characters, specifically Morgan Le Fay, who is Morgaine in The Mists of Avalon, but more commonly known as Morgan Le Fay. So what I've unearthed is that Morgan Le Fay is always portrayed as kind of this villainous or greedy or petulant or just not very nice person. Instead of the women being this backdrop for the legend, she's pushed them to the forefront and given it a unique spin, which is incredible. And the book has been the recipient of a lot of praise. It is award-winning. Even some of the distasteful, I say distasteful like it's no big deal, but even some of the author's transgressions are overlooked because of the weight and the significance of her work. If you're curious, you can do a quick Google search for Marion Zimmer Bradley, and you will see all you need to know. I'm not getting into it here, but that was book 1. Book 2 was a risk. I took a risk, and I took a risk because when I set out to find reads for these subgenres, I genuinely am trying to find something I'm going to enjoy. I'm not setting myself up to read books I don't like. I mean, that would be ridiculous. That's not what's going on here. So I wanted the most contemporary spin on something, quite frankly, ancient. I ended up deciding on a new release called By Force Alone. This book is by Lavie Tidhar. It was just released in August of 2020. Like, I pre-ordered it as soon as I knew that I was going to read it for Arthurian Fantasy, and it was probably a matter of days before it was actually released. And again, I tackled the audiobook on this one. This is the story of, again, the majority of the legend. And the author has put a gritty crime gang style spin on the story. So think Scarface meets King Arthur, and there you have it. And finally, I was actually undecided about the third book that I would read, especially after reading Mists of Avalon and By Force Alone. And I ended up really doing a deep dive search to find the perfect Arthurian fantasy for me. And I found this book, this one right here, called Lancelot. This is by Giles Kristian. This is actually unavailable to those of us in the United States via Audible or Kindle. So I purchased the paperback from the Book Depository, and I wasn't in a huge hurry, so I just waited for Book Depository to ship it to me. So this is obviously the story of Lancelot. As far as the Arthurian legend is concerned, this book focuses solely on Lancelot's role in it. And it follows and starts with him as an 8-year-old boy. So we follow Lancelot through nearly his entire life. The author does take a few liberties with the original legend. The events in Mists of Avalon and the events of By Force Alone are pretty similar. They're just told in a very different way. Lancelot is a book that plays with some of those events and colors them in a way to make an interesting narrative around one character. So those are the 3 books that I read. Arthurian Fantasy is fascinating to me because, to my knowledge, it's the only subgenre where every book in that subgenre is going to have the same story. Like, it's the same characters. I read paranormal thriller previous to this, and that's like saying that every paranormal thriller was going to contain the same characters and the same events. That's crazy. That's crazy to me. And I'm really fascinated by that idea. I'm fascinated that there are people out there that would consider Arthurian fantasy novels to be their favorite kinds. Like, those people read books over and over again with the same characters, and they know what happens. And there's, it's just fascinating. And I'm not trying to mock it because it's incredible that one, I don't want to say event, but I mean that one portion of world history has been retold and elevated and respun and so many times that it has its own subgenre of literature. That's huge. That is huge. And I just wish that I knew somebody who's a diehard fan of Arthurian fantasy, because I would really like to just pick their brain about the experience of reading books that have the same stories over and over and only differ in the author's execution. On the flip side of that, though, this is the kind of stuff that I would love in an academic setting to research, where I gather as much information as possible and draw conclusions from it. That's where I think Arthurian fantasy and I would get along great, in an academic setting where somebody told me I had to read all of these different Arthurian fantasy novels and find the commonalities between them and highlight the differences between them and sort of make it some scholarly endeavor. I would definitely do that. Like, that would be super interesting to me. But from an entertainment standpoint, no. Like, from an entertainment standpoint, I'm too reliant on variation, different stories and voices and characters and emotions. And I think that's what I would love to study or love to figure out is how much variation exists in a genre of books that all have the same premise. Mind-blowing and fascinating. And I have so much respect for authors who can hear the same story, and authors who can be so passionate about the legend that they think of interesting ways to retell it. Here's what I've learned about me as a reader of Arthurian fantasy. Not only that I couldn't seek out multiple versions of the same story. Like I said, I would love to talk to the person who can do that, who does do that. This is also not a story or a legend that interests me a great deal. My decision to read a book in this category from here on out would be entirely based on the way that the author promises to have executed it. You know, an interesting spin. What I've decided is that I don't like to be told the legend. I don't like the sweeping generational story. Those books set out to tell me all of it, to tell me the whole thing, as if they are recording a history. Granted, they're completely different in tone, and they're just completely different. Whoa. But I don't care. There's no way on earth that I could possibly care about all of the characters that those types of books expect me to care about. Again, probably wasn't this video, probably the video before, but when it's all about emotions, introducing me to a lot of characters, I'm just not going to be emotionally invested in events. Like, my emotional connections to books typically come from the characters, empathizing with the characters, seeing it through the characters' eyes. And that's most effective for me when it's trimmed down a little bit. And that's why, you know, Lancelot was so successful for me and these other two weren't, because they were just too epic. They were just too huge. In fact, in Mists of Avalon, like, it was difficult to listen to because it's almost a foreign language when you are entirely a contemporary reader and you're used to words and phrases and events and personalities that exist today. When all of this information is getting thrown at you, intended to be reflections of life in 5th century Britain, it was hard. It was hard. And I started with Mists of Avalon and just struggled. And just when I found this kernel to like latch onto, the book switches gears. So Mists of Avalon starts by telling the story of Morgane, or Morgan Le Fay, and Arthur, their parent. You know, Igraine has Morgane with her husband Gorlois, French, Gorlois. That's harder to say than I thought it was going to be. Welcome to the first time I'm saying it out loud. And then catches the eye of Uther Pendragon. Uther Pendragon, of course, being Arthur's father. Uther, with the help of Merlin, kind of gets in there, and that's how Arthur comes to be. I was just getting to the point where I was genuinely interested in Igraine and Uther as individuals and really latching onto them and really starting to care about them. And then the book is like, whoop, here we go. We're following Morgan now. We're going to follow her now. And that's fair. I mean, it's her book, pretty much. So I just don't like that. Like, let me love on my characters. Give me up front the characters that you want me to love on. Leave the rest of them alone. And it was too hard. I could not fathom 50 hours of it. I don't like saying that I DNF'd it, because I didn't make the choice to like forsake the book. I was not capable of the book. Like, I was not worthy of the book. The book was beautifully written. Like, it sounded beautiful, even though I didn't understand it. You know, it might have been different if I was consuming it with my eyes instead of my ears. That may also be why Lancelot was a standout for me this month, because it is the only book that I did read in physical form instead of listening to, but I just wasn't worthy of the Mists of Avalon. I'm not the right reader for that book. And like I said, I have no doubt, and I would never say that the Arthurian legend should not be told from the female perspective. That's why it failed me. Or the author did horrible things in their life, and that's why I'm not reading this book. Or I was not mad at it. It was just kind of this understanding that I was never going to understand, at least at that point in my life, in the state of mind that I was in, and in the format in which I was trying to consume it. So, not the fault of Mists of Avalon. On the other hand, no, I don't mean that. But I had high hopes for By Force Alone because I thought that it was going to introduce enough contemporary kinds of things, a tone and an atmosphere, and themes more contemporary, more recognizable to me. And I thought that it would make it easier. Not true. This one, though, I do question my reaction to it because I listened on audio. I had a major problem with the narrator. I think that the narrator made it too satirical, I can't say lighthearted, but I mean, I think that the narrator prevented me from taking it seriously. And it's already difficult to take the book seriously because you're talking about some really over-the-top portrayals of some very classic characters. This book is explicit. This book is just a major turnoff a lot of times. Not having a ton of experience with Arthurian legend, the one thing that I didn't realize that I would like to latch onto is honorability. the themes about, duty and honor and sacrifice and how tragic those things are. And those are all very, to me, heavy themes and things to take into consideration. And that's what I immediately think of when I think of that legend. And By Force Alone just kind of obliterated all of that. It kind of took the honor and the nobility out of it and kind of made it tasteless in some ways. And that to me was shocking because of all of the things that I would expect from an Arthurian fantasy. Tasteless is definitely not one of them. And that's harsh. It sounds like very, very harsh criticism. But keep in mind, I'm coming at this from a total outsider's perspective. My own biases and assumptions are surely coloring these opinions. I would never go on Goodreads and give Mists of Avalon or By Force Alone bad ratings. I would never do that because I am not I am not the one. I'm not, that's inappropriate to me. But I mean, just so much foul language and so much hatred and greed and deception, but not in the ways of the classic tale, more so in like contemporary, unnecessary, gratuitous way. And it just didn't work for me. I was about ready to give up. And then Lancelot came into my life. Lancelot by Giles Kristian. To be honest with you, I have no idea how I found this book. It could have been a Goodreads list. Obviously, as a contemporary romance reader, when I think of Arthurian legend, the part that's going to appeal to me most is going to be the love stories of it, the romances of it. So clearly Lancelot stuck out at me right away. It was just kind of like, that's a no-brainer. But then I started looking into it, looking to get my hands on a copy. What I found is that it is praised really highly. both by critics and by other readers. I think right now it has a 4.25 rating on Goodreads. It was released in 2018. It was hard to, I mean, there was enough good things said about it that I went through the trouble of getting it, even though it's meant to be unavailable to me for the most part, at least in convenient form. I intend for my next video to be entirely about this book. So there might be some overlap, and I'm going to give more away in that video than I am in this one. But as far as Arthurian fantasy goes, yeah, there's a guy named Lancelot and a guy named Arthur and a guy named Merlin and a girl named Guinevere. And, it contains all of the elements that make it Arthurian fantasy. Is it true to Arthurian legend? No. I mean, the author himself admits to have taken some liberties with it. I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly how it is and how it's alike and how it's different. I know that it wasn't very similar to Mists of Avalon or By Force Alone. It wasn't a completely different story that I'd never heard of. It was very recognizable, having just read 2 stories about the same stuff. The legend in here was very recognizable to me. And I definitely can understand why someone who does value Arthurian legend and holds it to a very high standard, why they would not be a fan. As a person who isn't overly attached to Arthurian legend, I'm perfectly fine with Giles Kristian swooping in and making a few changes to the legend itself in order to deliver me something like this, because this is incredible. And I think why it worked for me where the other ones didn't was it was solely focused on one character and one character's journey through that legend, instead of being focused on the legend and people who journeyed in and out of it. This was all about Lancelot. It's told in first person. It is intimate, and it allows me to connect to a character, latch on, empathize. It's not what I need to say in this video about Arthurian fantasy is that it's not going to work for everyone. It worked for me. It'll work for you if you're maybe looking for a place to start with Arthurian fantasy. Maybe start with something like this because it really reads more like books that you and I would be used to. However, if you're the other type who primarily reads historical fantasy, because this is not going to be historically accurate, Arthurian fantasy, because this is not going to be told exactly like the other books, then you might have some problems with this. This book is not perfect. It's not. But for me as a reader, it's wow. It just ticked a lot of boxes. And I've never been so stunned to start a project with a category of books that I'm not that excited about, have 2 lackluster experiences kind of validating my initial fears about reading Arthurian fantasy, then to do a complete 180, be blown away by this book that came out of nowhere and was everything that I walked into this project thinking that the Arthurian legends were. When I got all emotional earlier, about to do it again. What? How am I ever going to film a full video about this book if I can't even briefly talk about it without crying? This book has everything that By Force Alone stripped away. This book has the duty and the honor and the grief and the tragedy and the love and the betrayal and the, triumph and the sorrow and the honorability. And so I was completely surprised. And so surprised that I immediately ordered this book for myself in hardcover, as well as the follow-up to this book by Giles Kristian called Camelot, which is centered around Galahad, which is Lancelot's son, and his quest for the Holy Grail. So not only did I find an Arthurian fantasy that I loved. I happen to love it more than a lot of the other books on my shelves that I've raved about. And it's making me read more. What? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I do this genre project. That this month is all I could have hoped for. Like, this is why. It humbles me, thinking that I know myself so well that I only read the things that could ever possibly be interested in, and then forcing myself to read other things because I'm going to get smarter. And then finding out that all of this time, or at least since 2018, there was something out there that I was missing. Something was missing. And I didn't even know it. And I found it in Arthurian Fantasy. That is weird. That is weird. I am super happy to make this video. I am super excited about this book and singing its praises for a very long time, and reading Camelot and hopefully singing its praises as well. You are looking at a pretty happy booktuber. I'm not going to lie. Never thought this would be the video that I would be making after reading 3 Arthurian Fantasy novels. Just absolutely nuts. So, did this turn out how you expected? Because it didn't turn out how I expected. But I'm curious to know how you feel about Arthurian Fantasy, what you thought I would feel about Arthurian Fantasy, and how surprised are you right now? You need to let me know, because I'm shocked. I will be back in my next video to talk specifics about the book Lancelot, and then we will be leaving Arthurian Fantasy behind, at least temporarily, and moving on into dark fantasy. I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say, because it's the last time that I'm going to be like, I'm not going to like anything. No, because turns out I'm wrong. So thank you for following me on this crazy journey. My husband thought I was nuts for wanting to do a genre project, like wanting to commit myself to reading 3 books a month that would be similar, first off, that might be unenjoyable. Sometimes I thought I was crazy too for doing it, but not now. So thank you for joining me on this journey and for always watching and supporting me. I appreciate it very much, and I will see you all very soon.